Well, good morning, everyone. It's good to be here with you. A blessing to gather in this way. The subject we're talking about this morning is called On a Mission, Not an Island. And so it has a lot to do with networking and interaction between churches in the kingdom of God. So just as an introductory thought, near the home place in Martindale, Pennsylvania, where I grew up, was a church that was known for its roadside signs. And one of the signs that I remember from my boyhood days was, "Lord, give me patience and give it now." So if that is your prayer, do not expect a divine download of supernatural patience, but instead expect to be baptized into fiery trials where God will teach you patience. In a similar way, a few years later, I was teaching school in a school of Russian, Ukrainian students, and they'd come straight out of public school. And so some days it was more of a zoo than a school. And one of the prayers that I had then was for wisdom. And I didn't receive a divine download of wisdom. I had the zoo to deal with, and probably gained a few, I actually lost my hair and grew a few gray hair in the process. So in the same way, I have long had this desire for more collaboration and networking among churches. It's been a theme of my life going back, probably about as far back as I can remember. And there's probably multiple reasons for that, probably not the least of which being that my dad worked internationally among Germans, Russian, Chinese, etc. And I think that kind of, from a very young age, broadened my view of the kingdom of God. But I grew up in nationwide fellowship, an interconnected fellowship of over 100 churches. And they collaborated well among themselves, and even to some extent conferences surrounding them. But even to me, and experientially, that was somewhat insufficient. But don't you know, God saw fit to tear me from that fellowship and immerse me in a somewhat isolated, independent fellowship of 6 families that then dwindled to 5, and now we're back to 9. But I think it's there that hopefully I'm learning, and we together are learning true networking, collaboration, and even oneness within the body of Christ. As the program or the presentation description suggests, church planting is inherently risky and volatile. And there's many reasons for that, probably not the least being that Jesus, surprise, surprise, chose humans to work with him. And that's just going to create a lot of challenges. So there's going to be personal immaturity and inexperience. There's difficult prior church experience to work through. Church planting may include the deconstruction of established norms and then the corresponding recreation of new norms and expectations, and all of that can be extremely volatile. There's isolation and loneliness. There's disappointment and disillusionment. And then there's fragmentation. We live in an era of intense fragmentation. 41,000 Christian denominations today, all claiming to be connected to the original church planters, Jesus and his apostles. Jesus' high priestly prayer of John 17 seems to be a distant and unattainable dream. And perhaps living in this era of fragmentation has fractured our capacity to even imagine a future of wholeness. But maybe our dispersed and isolated church plants struggle with networking because we've lost the possibility. We don't even know if it's possible anymore. But dare to imagine with me that it is possible and even advisable for churches to be a connected body. Dare to imagine with me that we can actually push back against the fragmentation that has marked this era and work towards Jesus' desire for oneness. And I think church planters are in a good position to build this kind of community. They are already creating new norms and expectations, and networking can just be one of those new expectations. Established or multi-generational churches that have been established for multiple generations already, may lack the willpower for new experiences and may not see the need for networking beyond what is already established. As one Mennonite bishop said, and I may or may not be using a fictitious name here, but the good news about Whispering Pines is that nothing will change anytime soon. And the bad news about Whispering Pines is that, I'm sorry, I kind of botched this and you're already reading it, but let me try again. The good news about Whispering Pines is that nothing will change anytime soon. The bad news about Whispering Pines is that nothing will change anytime soon. So church plants are often in a place of establishing new norms. Learn to leverage that opportunity that brings. But a few disclaimers I need to go over before we get into this subject any further. First and foremost, I am not advocating ecumenical unity at all costs. There are things that Jesus specifically excludes from his kingdom, and we can do no less. Secondly, any solution or opinion that I offer is shared in the context of my own spiritual gifts, callings, and interests. As such, inherently, I will be unbalanced. I do need the gifts of my brothers to create further, fuller, and richer solutions. Third, there may always be a tension to hold between what is right for the local body and what allows the local body to blend with the larger body. The aforesaid Whispering Pines may be secure in who they are, but they may risk barring from the fellowship the very people they need to break up stagnation. Finally, I don't know how all of this plays out in real life. I have more questions than answers. But I am on a journey of discovery, and today I'd like to invite you to walk along with me for a short time on this journey. So the presentation is going to be divided into three parts. There's going to be the theological portion, then there's going to be the practical, and then finally open discussion. So I'm going to keep the theological kind of short and punchy. The practical part will be a little more rambling, open-ended, and perhaps experiential in nature. But really the open mic part where we discuss this might be the most important, where we kind of try to bring it all together. The last couple of years here at Church Planters in the evenings, there was a fire, like a campfire up here, and maybe there was another one I'm sure that was not a part of, but in particular I remember 2 years ago up here by a campfire, a group of us sat around and we discussed what practical networking looks like. And it was very relaxed and so forth. So, if you kind of need that vibe, just imagine a campfire here, and we're sitting around the campfire and we're having a campfire chat. Okay. All right, so for the theological reasons, I'm going to read just a couple of scriptures, 3 scriptures actually here, and then we'll discuss them in a little more detail. So first of all, John chapter 17. John 17, verses 20 to 23. This chapter is commonly known as Jesus' high priestly prayer. And just notice the language that Jesus is using here. Verse 20, I do not ask for these only, that's his disciples, but also for those who will believe in me through their word. So Jesus is praying for you in the future. I do not ask for these alone, or I do not ask for these only, but also for those who will believe in me through their word, that they may all be one, just as you, Father, are in me, and I in you, that they also may be in us, so that the world may believe that you have sent me. The glory that you have given me, I have given to them, that they may be one, even as we are one. So you see Jesus' prayer there, his heart for oneness. And if you read that chapter, it's kind of built in that whole context. But you see specifically Jesus' words here in prayer for the oneness of his followers. And then if you would turn to Matthew 28, if you have your Bibles, I'll just read those verses there, Matthew 28. Of course, this is known as the Great Commission. So Matthew 28, 18 to 20 says, "And Jesus came and said to them, all authority in heaven and earth all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all things that I have commanded you. And behold, I am with you always, even to the end of the age." And then we'll read in Revelation chapter 7, where John sees the prophetic fulfillment of exactly that. So Revelation 7 and verse 9 to 11. "And after this I looked, and behold, a great multitude that no one could number, from every nation and from all tribes and all peoples and languages, standing before the throne and before the Lamb, clothed in white robes, with palm branches in their hands, and crying out with a loud voice, 'Salvation belongs to our God, who sits on the throne, and of the Lamb,'" and so forth. So John prophetically sees the fulfillment of all nations, kindred, and tongue gathered before the Lord. So again, we notice Jesus' high priestly prayer. We notice the commission to make disciples of all nations, and we see the prophetic fulfillment of that. But between Jesus' prophetic expectation and John's prophetic vision of the fulfillment, there was a crisis that tested the resolve of the church as to whether or not they would be one. Would they devolve into sectarianism, or would they honor Jesus' desire for oneness in filling the Great Commission? And that answer should be instructive for us. That, of course, was the Jew-Gentile conflict. So in Galatians 1, Paul tells the story of his conversion and how that after his conversion, he received the gospel via direct revelation from Jesus. The 12 apostles in Jerusalem, they had received the gospel from Jesus in person, and of course the work of the Holy Spirit, but they had lived and walked and talked with Jesus and received their instruction from him. Paul's was received via direct revelation. In Galatians 2, Paul recounts how he went up to Jerusalem, and there he communicated the gospel that he had received by revelation to Peter, James, and John. And it says that after he had communicated the gospel to them that he had received by revelation, they gave him the right hand to fellowship. The gospel that Paul taught and the gospel that the 12 taught were exactly the same. So then in Galatians 2, we also see the story of the believing Jews from Jerusalem being sent by James, or at least coming down from James, whether or not they were sent by him, but they came down from Jerusalem to Antioch, which was the first multi-ethnic church. They were called Christians there because they followed Christ, but they were not Jews, at least many of them. They would have been Greeks. And these Jewish visitors down there at Antioch taught the Gentile believers that they needed to keep the law of Moses to be saved. This, as you know, caused a full-on ruckus as Peter withdrew himself from table fellowship with the Gentiles, fearing them, it says, that came from James. So fear was a motivating factor there. The fracas was so great that even Barnabas was carried away with the dissension. This represented a major rupture in the fabric of the early church. Jesus' desire for oneness between his disciples and their converts was being threatened. And this rupture could have remained permanent. James could have led a church of the Jews, and Paul could have led a church of the Greeks. Peter could have been an independent maverick, fellowshipping with the Greeks when James' followers were not around, and then withdrawing from them when the James followers showed up. But such fragmentation was unthinkable to those early followers of Jesus, and they called for a major conference to resolve the question. And that, of course, is the story of Acts 15. I'm not going to read the story, but in essence, the story went like this. They came together with a major disagreement and much disputing. The term much disputing is used there. But you see them discussing the issue and coming to a place of agreement. But mind you, this place of agreement was not a compromised position where each gave in a little bit, but it was a place of actual agreement, of true unity. In fact, the agreement and the unity was so compelling that it wasn't just among those gathered there, but it says that it brought rejoicing to the entire church. So if you're ever in controversy and looking for solutions, if it falls short of bringing rejoicing to the entire church, I think you haven't got to the bottom of true unity. That's a little side issue. But the solution was so compelling it brought rejoicing to the entire church. Jesus' desire for oneness was preserved. One Lord, one faith, and one baptism. So the case I'm making is this, the theological case. Jesus prayed for the oneness of his followers. John saw its prophetic fulfillment. The early followers of Jesus acted upon that vision. Building oneness and connectedness across churches as followers of Jesus is not an unattainable ideal. It is part and parcel to the faith that was once delivered. The very least that we can do in an era of fragmentation is to build a sense of oneness within our circle of influence. We can push back against the divisiveness of modern Christianity and fulfill Jesus' desire for oneness within our sphere of influence. So that's the theological portion. So let's move now to the more practical aspects. So let's do a thought experiment just to set the framework for practical discussions. Imagine that you were the only Christian family that existed, or at least the only family that you knew. Would you be able to fulfill Jesus' command, his commission, to make disciples of all nations, while simultaneously meeting all the needs of your family? Now imagine that a three-family church plant attempts to fulfill the Great Commission, disciples of all nations, and meet the needs of its families. Are you able to do this? I think the answer is not very effectively. We need a larger network to bring the gospel, the kingdom, to the world while meeting the needs of our families. Of course, I do recognize throughout history there's always been extenuating circumstances, and God does give grace for those. But in the era when we have the opportunity for broader networking, it is an opportunity. It's not only an opportunity, I think it's actually an obligation. So what are these needs? What are we talking about? Well, there's at least 5 categories that we're going to talk about. It's not an exhaustive list. Rather, it's not an exhaustive list, but it is 5 that we're going to touch on. So they're physical, financial, social, emotional, and spiritual. At some level, these kind of like blend together, like where does physical and financial actually divide? They're kind of both physical in a way. But there is some nuance there. So in some of the descriptions of need that I'm going to talk about, your response might be, well, those needs are better met within the body than they are on a broader sense. And that may well be true. But I think we need to think about these things as concentric circles. You have family, you have church, and then you have the broader body. So what is true of the individual's need for the family also applies to the family's need for the church, also applies to the church's need for the greater body. So as an example of what I mean, or what I'm talking about with physical needs, about 20 years ago, my father and I began to disciple a young man from Massachusetts, from the area there close to where we live. Very unique young man, very energetic. And at the age of 15, he began keeping bees. He brought honey to a farmer's market that we were hosting at our place of business. And over the next 20 years, he built this incredible honeybee pollination and honey sales empire. So he owned a farm in Georgia. This is, development. He developed this. He eventually owned a farm in Georgia and a farm in Massachusetts. He lived between those two states, depending upon where the majority of his bees were. So his bees would start in the south and follow the pollination season north, and they do some western stints in the meantime, sending bees as far west as California for the almond pollination there. 11 years ago, he married a young woman by the name of Elaine, a young Mennonite girl from Ontario. And together they had 3 sons and 2 daughters. Tragically, 2 weeks and 2 days ago, he was killed in a farm accident. That was intentional. Thank you. Appreciate it. He was working along the side of a road, and he was loading bees onto a trailer, and a vehicle came and ran into him, and he was killed, they believe, instantly. They put him on life support, but they don't believe that he ever really was alive after being hit. He left behind a grieving widow, 5 fatherless children, and a highly dynamic honeybee business whose details existed only in the head of his now deceased owner. But what I'm getting at is this. What we saw happen over the next few days was incredible, because where the accident happened was in Ohio, and it was very close to a church there that some of us had connections to. He was part of a church in Georgia. He had come into the church through the church in Massachusetts, and she was from Ontario. And these churches all came together to resolve this situation. And the details of it all are not really that important. But one church planned the funeral, the other hosted it. 5 churches stepped in to provide food for the massive funeral. Business caretakers were appointed to take care of business. Tragedy pulled these very diverse churches together. So I'm using an extreme and tragic case to illustrate the point. Life is complicated, even without tragedy. But life can be made easier by the cooperation of people and churches. Families can easily be overwhelmed by the complexities of life. Small churches can be easily overwhelmed when its families are overwhelmed. So in the same way that families within the fellowship can draw strength from the other families, so fellowships can draw strength from each other, from other fellowships, from each other. So then there's also financial needs. And so one of the things that the Anabaptist Church, I think, has always done well is common purse sharing. And that's been on the range all the way from the Hutterite model, if you will, to the much more independent model. But at some level, the one thing that all Anabaptists agree upon and do practice, at least to some level, is common purse sharing. Pooling money together for needs. And that fosters a culture of generosity and interchurch sharing. And that's a good thing. And when we become too independent, we can easily lose that need of relying upon each other. There's overwhelming financial losses that do happen. There's lawsuits, there's medical needs, there's house fires, there's job loss. And all of those things provide opportunities for churches to share, because if you take these small, dispersed, independent, unaffiliated churches and church plants, there is not going to be the capacity or the ability to meet all these needs that do arise. And so an interconnected web becomes very important. Also, there's financial capital. So sometimes in church plant expansion, There's one church helps another church get started, maybe starting with job opportunities, online job opportunities, working for people back home. There's loans that are made for houses, things like that, and even money to create, buildings, to buy buildings like for maybe a cafe or a place to meet or anything like that. And the financial capital moves around within these church plants, and that's a good thing. God always has the way of providing, His way of providing, but sometimes the way He provides is through your brothers. Then, of course, there's the social needs. So included in those social needs are just the need for friendship. It can get really lonely and isolated in a distant church plant where there's just a few families. It can feel, very isolating at times. And having churches that we can actually connect with, build friendships to, builds the sense of being part of something larger than ourselves. And another part of this, of course, is the marriage pool. So when our family left the Nationwide Fellowship, our children were a little older. I believe our oldest one, Austin, was either 15 or 16 at the time. And it was a concern to us, like, who are our children going to marry? When we were within the Nationwide setting, if you were a Nationwide boy, you pretty much married a Nationwide girl. It was just a given. And if you were Eastern, you married Eastern. And someone told me, I think Kyle said that if you're Weaverland Conference, you're going to marry Weaverland Conference. So it's pretty common. Now, there's a little bit of crossover, but by and large, that's just pretty much true. When you step outside of those large social groups, the marriage pool becomes a lot more dynamic. And that was a concern that Roxanne and I had. Like, who would our children marry? And in the last year, 3 of them have gotten married. And I will say it's a very dynamic process. It probably is anyway, but given the fact that there's multiple backgrounds, my one daughter married into someone from a BMA background, son married a Beachy girl, and our other daughter married someone from a independent fellowship, but maybe like Southeast related. So I'm just saying that's how diverse and dynamic it can be. And I think if churches learn to work together, build relationships, it's actually healthy. That youth, it actually increases that marriage pool. Now, some of you are probably young enough that you're not even thinking about this, right? Or, my children are a long way from this, and it's probably true, but trust me, it goes pretty fast. The children come to this age of looking for marriage partners, and it just happens quickly. Kind of blink, and there it is. But if your children are young, that's, you have a lot of life to live, and there's a lot of time to figure these things out. There is and there isn't. The time will come. And I also know that, some of you probably are thinking that, well, we're really good friends with this family over here. We're good friends with this family over here. We're kind of different backgrounds. We're good friends. Maybe something will happen here. Probably not. That's just a cute idea. Probably not. It's going to come from somewhere else, is my expectation. Or our experience, I should say. So, again, church networking just provides for all those social needs that are experienced in our families. The sense of friendship, part of being something larger than ourselves, and also the marriage pool. Emotional needs. We all go through seasons of strength. We go through seasons of weakness. And the overwhelming work of church planting and disciple making can take a toll on us emotionally. Drawing from the support and experience of church planters can ease that emotional turmoil, can ease the emotional turmoil of the work. So again, the same way we draw strength within the church, we can inter-church, we can also draw strength intra-church. Then of course there's spiritual things. So doctrinal issues. So we can be really siloed into our own thoughts sometimes. My pet subjects, the things that I like and the things that I talk about, I can really be siloed into that train of thought and be really unbalanced. I could be like completely avoiding other doctrines and other things that are important. But having a broader church group that we associate with allows me to be balanced And the things that are important to you may be less important to me, but in working together, we have a fuller, richer experience and more balanced understanding of doctrine. And also within churches, one of the weaknesses of these small independent churches is they're easily racked by strong personalities. So if you have 3 families together and you have a couple personalities that are really, really strong, that can just really create a lot of inner turmoil. Sometimes some of us stronger personalities are just better diluted into a bigger church. And I think in the same way, when we have other churches to rely upon, we can draw strength from their strengths and stay more grounded on doctrinal issues, not be swung off by every wind of doctrine. We stay grounded in the faith that is once delivered. Bible schools to build common conviction among youth, I think, is a good thing. As we experience it within our own fellowship, the youth tend to go to this Bible school and to that Bible school and the other Bible school, and there's kind of not been a real consistent place that they go to. That's quite different from my upbringing. So within Nationwide, you went to Nationwide Bible schools. If you were Eastern, you went to Eastern Bible School. It was just a foregone conclusion. You knew where you were going, and you received your indoctrination there. I think it would be healthy among the dispersed, independent, unaffiliated churches to network together and maybe create Bible schools for the youth that would include the kind of expectations and teaching that we experience here. And of course, there is safety in the multitude of counselors. So here's my vision for networking. And I shared this vision with the home fellowship. I'm envisioning a network of churches that use the historic faith as the uniting platform, the faith that was once delivered. And there is a strong sense of identity that is created in obedience to and identity with the historic faith. Envisioning a network of churches that would share in common purse-sharing opportunities, that we would know who we would turn to in a time of crisis. Envisioning a network of churches that can work together on collaborative mission projects. So just as a side note, that's also something that the larger, older, multi-generational established churches have done well. They have their mission projects that they're working on. And I guess to be fair, church planting is a mission in and of itself, but as we'll talk about in just a little bit, youth do still, even in these church plants, have a desire to be part of something greater and to serve in other places. And so to have collaborative mission projects, I think, is a goal for our churches to enter into together. Youth Bible School, already mentioned that. Unified teaching to help build common conviction. Social pool, a network of churches that helps build our sense of a social pool and being part of something larger. Friendships outside our immediate circle for a sense of something larger. Marriage pool. Marriage takes place in the context of common teaching, core conviction, and shared experience. Service opportunities. We can have confidence sending our youth into service opportunities because we know the people involved there and who's running the service opportunity. And then, of course, the support for church plants. So if church plants are already collaborating in a networking kind of way, they have the ability to support new church plants. And then there is this term that I like to use called interdependence, as an antidote to independence. Churches learn to yield to a movement in the same way that families learn to yield to a church. So families need to learn to yield within the church they're a part of, but it's good for churches to learn to yield to a broader movement as well. Many of us don't like the term independent, and so I think interdependence is a good anecdote to that. So if you think about these types of relationships in regards to marriage, You have the spectrum that's referred to sometimes as independent marriages, interdependent marriages, or codependent marriages. And codependency has the idea of I can't be without the other. Like my identity is wrapped up in who the other person is and controlled by who the other person is. Independence is where we live our own, disconnected lives. Maybe even dysfunctional, but for sure disconnected. But interdependence is where there is a sense within marriage of strengths drawn together, and each person is made better for who they are by the strength they draw from the other. And so I think we can learn to be interdependent churches rather than independent churches, where we learn to draw from the strengths of each other. So in short, I'm envisioning a network of historic faith churches that collaborate to bring the kingdom of God to earth, making disciples of all nations, while meeting all the spiritual, emotional, social, and physical needs of our families. Thank you. God bless you. So I understand the next part of the session here is for open mic, and that is where you bring your ideas, and Kent has the microphone there. So if you have something you'd like to add, a question you'd like to ask, raise your hand and Kent will bring you the mic.
So just a question to get discussion started, I guess, and it's a question I have. You were talking about the early church, the theology of unity there, and the early church. It was unthinkable for them to just go different ways and have a Gentile church and a Jewish church. But at the same time, I'm remembering that they did say, Paul, you go to the Gentiles, Peter, you go to the Jews. And they did have those who kept on practicing Judaism as Christians and those who did not. So my question is, what enabled them to see that as one church? Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And for us, what would enable us to see a church with differences as one church?
Sure. Yeah, so does anyone have a thought on that they would like to offer? I, of course, have my own to offer, but I'd like to hear from you. So in part, Truman, I don't know if this answers it entirely. Again, these things have to be, fleshed out, worked out. But they were specific areas of ministry. And that is in those passages there that I mentioned, where Paul says specifically that he was given the ministry to the Gentiles, and Peter says that the gospel had been committed to him for among the Jews. Interestingly enough, in the Jerusalem Council, he does say there that God made choice a good while ago among us that the Gentiles by my mouth should hear the word, right? So even while Peter had a particular call to the Jewish people, you do see him going to the Gentiles. And that, of course, was the story of Cornelius, right? I believe that that's what Peter's referring to there, is going to the house of Cornelius. So yeah, I think there are areas of service, of call, particular mission too. Yet they would not see themselves as separate churches. They were, or as they saw themselves as one church. There's sort of an interesting overlay that happens there. This is a little bit of a bunny trail, but the fact is that the Jerusalem Council, I believe, was held in early AD 50, and in AD 70, the temple was destroyed. And so Torah keeping in its fullness would not be possible after AD 70, right? So that was a very short overlap where Jew and Gentile were kind of, or the Gentile, a short period of overlap where the Jews could essentially practice their Jewishness. And then when the temple was destroyed, that was sort of like, to me, I believe that was like the final rupture. Like at that point, Torah was done. and could not be revived. And so there was this overlapping time period there where there was probably more to work through regarding all of that. Yes, David?
Yeah, I would agree totally with what you said. It's interesting that even during that period, there was never, like in Corinth or any of those cities, Rome, a Jewish church and a Gentile church. They're always there together. And Paul is usually having to counsel the Jews to not try to impose Judaism on the Gentiles. But they never split into Gentile churches and Jewish churches, other than perhaps like Jerusalem, just because of the geographic area that was predominantly Jewish. But like I say, when you look at these other cities, despite a fairly major point of contention, it is interesting that they still were always one church in those cities.
Yes. Yeah, thank you for that, David.
So to bring this just a little closer home, many church planters here over the last 10 years have talked about the hesitation or resistance they felt from more established churches whenever they thought about doing some kind of church planting that maybe was not as well, using a model that was not as familiar.
Sure.
So the model that Paul and Barnabas would have used, for example, most Anabaptist churches, Kingdom Christian churches, are fine with doing that overseas. But whenever people have talked about doing that here in North America, they got a fair bit of pushback. We just don't do that. We just don't do it that way in North America. Here's how we do it in North America. So I know some of you here have experienced that already. Many people over the years have talked about that. So Truman's question was, how can we all be one church? And especially with this kind of dynamic going on, is there ways that we can become more of one church than what we are presently is a question I have. So this is kind of an open discussion. I have heard comments also from church planters who've kind of looked down on farmers and people who live back a long lane and made comments about all they ever did was grow up on the same farm and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Not thinking about that those folks are contributing to the kingdom of God as well. They're building infrastructure. They're building values. A lot of them are contributing significant amounts of financial support to those that are doing things in a more, efforts that need finances. They're supporting those kinds of things. And so something I've personally tried to cultivate over the years is thinking of those people as being just as much a part of the kingdom as those of us that are pursuing something that's not as familiar in the Anabaptist world. But I'm wondering if there's a way we could cultivate, nurture this here at this forum, as well as the way we relate to folks that maybe hesitate or can't get behind church planting efforts that are a little different.
So I think one crucial element is respect. Learning to respect and honor. Learning to not cast judgment. So to be very wary, on guard against judgmentalism, and to also give all due respect. I think those things are going to go a long way, and they need to flow both directions. Whether it's the church plant to older, established ways of doing things, giving honor and respect, not casting judgmentalism, but then the opposite would be true. But maybe because we tread the new territory, the bulk of that effort may actually be on us.
I have a lot of questions, but I'm not sure how to ask them.
I'm like you, I have more questions than answers.
So I think for most of us at least, when we think about networking / fellowship / conference, or like we don't know how to think about this in some ways other than the ways we've seen it done in the past, that we've said, well, we don't want that, but we're not quite sure what we do want. Okay, you are casting a vision for a network that in a lot of ways is a lot of us who are here, right? And the churches we represent. So I can see a scenario, say 10 years down the road, we have, let's call it Church Planters Fellowship, Church Planters Forum Fellowship, okay. Church Planters Forum Christian Fellowship, okay. So one thing that does is it says, yes, we are part of this group. But then it also says that there's some people that are not part of this group, and then they're on the outside. We're including some people, we're excluding others. And we do that in our local fellowships, or in our local congregations, right? I think we feel a need to do that. And to me, making Church Planters Christian Fellowship would actually exclude some people that we want to be here. Can you help me think about this in more practical ways?
Yeah. It's a good question. Probably somebody has a better answer for Wendell than I do. Kevin, I'm sure you just have an answer, don't you?
So Wendell, I think I see what you're saying there with the possibility of this creating a kind of another denomination. So it's natural to think of this network being people that we know and are here, that kind of thing. But maybe a key part of where we're trying to head is to think about what churches around us are not here that we can network with, and how can we network with them even if they never come here.
I think that's sort of where the answer lies. I agree 100% with what you said. Like, a lot of us, probably from what we have observed, like you said, we think of this in terms of what we have observed. And we say, well, I've been hurt by that in the past, or that was not a good experience, or whatever the case may have been. And we don't want to go there. So then, from a theoretical perspective, we're like, we try to weigh the merits of that and what this could look like in theory. I think maybe it just starts at some level with the willpower that we want to be more collaborative, like with just the default heart position perhaps, that we're looking for those opportunities and we build them where we can. And maybe it kind of shifts the balance of what actually happens in our experience. Okay, so then another way of thinking about this, like you're saying, it's maybe we should think about this as more of a mindset. So should I? Starts there. Or it starts there. So should I be thinking about, instead of thinking about the churches in Massachusetts and Illinois and Pennsylvania that are pretty similar to our fellowship, our congregation, should I instead be thinking about the Northeast church that's an hour away from me, and the Beachy church that's an hour away, and the Beachy church that's 45 minutes away, and see how we can collaborate with them? What are your thoughts on that? Should we be thinking more about, say, I don't know, infiltrating or breaking down those denominational barriers, or should we be thinking more about who we are including here? Maybe that's a false dichotomy. Maybe it's both. Okay. Yeah. Yeah, I'm not sure which. Yeah, I'm not sure which is better. Mm-hmm. And again, it might be a scenario where it's a local context. Like, we don't. Let me say it this way: one church may not have that opportunity to build bridges to, say, Northeast or Pilgrim or whatever it might be, and others will. So. I think we probably all heard this statement said that abuse is not an argument for use, right? Like, just because things have gone haywire in the past doesn't mean that it's not still an ideal to work towards. And I think, interestingly enough, in the early church, the Acts 15 Jerusalem Council was a decision to include Jew and Gentile in one church. But as David already said, there was continuing work. So you see, like in Romans, Paul is saying, like, if I'm eating meat and that is causing my brother to offend because I don't know where it came from, I don't know if it was meat offered to idols or not, I'm not asking questions. Paul encourages there, saying to not ask questions. But if you know, then don't do it. Paul provided like all this nuance around that. But then I think it's in, is it Timothy or Titus, one of the pastoral letters there, where Paul says that, and he's writing saying that some will depart from the faith, commanding to abstain from marriage and from meats. And I kind of see that, I could be wrong, but I kind of read that in terms of the 4 decrees of the Jerusalem Council. So there's a prohibition against meat offered to idols, and there's a prohibition against sexual immorality. But then you can see kind of people kind of taking that and saying, well, sexuality and marriage kind of go like hand in glove, and so let's just have no marriage, right? And also, we don't know about these meats, we don't know where they came from. You know what? Just don't eat meat. And Paul is saying that is a departure from the faith. But then in Romans, he's also giving some nuance about when to eat, when not to eat, right? So I think there's these issues. There's always the need to navigate it in a faithful way. You can go off into extreme asceticism, or then also you go to the book of Revelation, you have 2 churches being called out for allowing fornication and the eating of meats offered to idols. All the way through the New Testament, this theme runs through, and you see them having to navigate that. So there's probably not an easy answer to give that's going to allow us to navigate these things. It's going to be a work in progress. But actually, you said you have more questions than I.
I don't have any that I have formulated right now, so someone else can definitely have a mic.
Hi, I'm afraid I'll get myself in trouble for asking this, but you mentioned about the dating pool issues and how it was very clear-cut in more established fellowships and so forth. I have a church we have 16 single females, usually maybe 1 bachelor at a time. I think we have 3 right now. But the idea of networking, you mentioned Bible, starting a Bible school. Orthodox Judaism has done a lot with matchmaking. I'm just curious what you think about help in the dating pool, especially when you have church plants that maybe feel like a family doesn't want to go because there's no other youth for their children to marry. It could be a disincentive. So how do we, any brainstorming on that?
Well, you probably all heard the joke that Bible schools are shoe factories, right? They go in to have their soles worked on and come out in pairs. So, I'm sorry, you asked a more specific question than that, and I don't know that I have a... Humor doesn't solve all our problems.
Okay. On the Bible school thing.
Raise your voice, Ernest.
On the talk about Bible schools, some of us have actually been discussing that this winter, about the possibility of starting a Bible school. And one of our questions is, do we want it to be a typical Bible school, or do we want it to be an atypical Bible school? So your typical Bible school is geared towards including everyone and giving everybody a chance to go to Bible school and experience what that's like. Your atypical Bible schools are the ones that have really high standards and high expectations and so forth. So I'd like to hear some discussion from you all. What kind of Bible school would you want for your children?
So I brought up the point, so maybe I'm the only one that is interested in that, except that you did say it was a broader conversation. I specifically have not given, the type of, for myself, of Bible school that much thought, just more looking for that type of opportunity. And I think I'd be open to multiple considerations.
I was just going to say, so my daughter's been to a couple Bible schools, and I appreciate that being an independent church, and we don't have any official connections to any particular school or network. I would say the Bible school she came home with the most growth and experienced the most was the one that pushed her the hardest and had the highest expectations. So I appreciate that.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. That's good feedback. The most growth came from the ones that pushed the expectations the hardest. It's fair.
So how do you determine, you were saying about a Bible school, atypical or typical, having been involved with the Bible school for 7.5 years, in answer to Nathan's thought, Bible schools are not necessarily the best place to find a partner, because normally you have a standard that everyone is supposed to meet, and you may not actually be meeting that standard normally. So you can have students that meet the standard, and when they leave, they're totally different. I think it would be better if we could do the inter-networking church thing, where you can see families, you can work together with families, you can see them in their natural settings. Gives you a much better perspective of whether the person is your spouse or not. But in thinking about Bible schools, you can have a Bible school that really pushes, but if your student is there for the good time, there's only so much you can do as a teacher or an administrator or whatever. There's only so much you can do. So the student has to want to be there for the right reason. And I think a lot of our students do go for the right reasons. Some of the students go for the party. And sometimes the student comes for the party and God gets a hold of them and changes them, and they leave a changed person. And sometimes not. But I think Bible schools can be good and serve a place, but they're not a cure-all for a personal walk with God.
Sure.
I guess I'll give a personal testimony. I found my wife at a Bible school, SMBI to be exact. But a little of the journey of how that happened, I was seeking the Lord and praying very fervently. And one night, laying in bed, God said very clearly, you need to sign up for SMBI, 5th term, a whole year in advance, and He'll provide. And I really struggled with that for a long time. I was like, this is really crazy and radical. I didn't really want to tell a whole lot of people going into it, but the Lord provided, and I'm thankful for that. And my wife's story of coming there was a miracle too, of how God orchestrated that for that to happen. And through that, I got to be head dean of men, so I'm supposed to be head dean of men, monitoring relationships, falling hardcore. Anyways.
Thank you for that.
I guess I had just a couple general observations on this topic in general. It's interesting. It's come up a lot in our local fellowship. Chuck even pulled us together during a men's midweek and asked a couple really interesting questions. So we study the early church a lot, and our church as a whole just really digs deep in that area. And he asked the question, because we know some people that have gone Orthodox, primarily Eastern Orthodox, Russian Orthodox, and gone in that direction. And he asked the question, what's attractive about those churches, about Eastern Orthodoxy, or why do some people end up there or find themselves there, and what's unattractive about that? And a lot of things that people mentioned were as far as attractiveness, was general overall unity, simplicity, preserving the initial faith, apostolic succession, fasting, some of these things. But it brought up a topic of how do you obtain unity when you have just such a large amount of churches kind of in the Anabaptist space, and is it appropriate to look at reasons for division of, why do churches divide? How does that happen? Why does it happen? When should it happen? When shouldn't it happen? And I've even thought, because I came from Church of Christ, where everything is super organized. It's literally like our organization was like a pyramid. You have a very clear hierarchy. We would plant churches, throughout the globe with 100,000 or more people, and those cities would then move to those plantings would then move to rural areas. It was very organized. You knew the oversight was very organized. It was all very clearly laid out, even in documents. So I guess there are two things. There are one. Where do you draw these lines of, when a church needs to divide? Or we've all seen plenty of churches that have divided over one single standard, and don't take Eucharist together because of that one single standard. Is it profitable to look at some of those reasons why church divide, and the overall? Can you even have, some type of global oversight where it's either a committee that other churches are looking to for direction? So for some of the younger churches that don't have elders established, can we look to an older group or committee for direction in a lot of areas, or just how to do this with a lot of young church plants that want to be tied into really the broader community and have direction in that area. So I don't know if I necessarily have, a question about that, but it seems to me that there's a ton of division over just standards, right? And is that appropriate? Is it not appropriate? And if it is, in the sense that we can have many, thousands of churches, is there a way to still tie us together, even though our standards are different, right?
Yeah, thank you for those thoughts, Nathan. Anyone have any comments? My own sense is that division will be necessary at some point. I think, as I mentioned, Jesus does exclude from his kingdom certain things, and I think throughout history probably there was necessary divisions. I think there was a lot of unnecessary ones, very unnecessary ones. And I think the reason for that may be that we do very poorly at conflict resolution. I think, I'm going to guess that probably very few of us in this room, maybe I'm just reading you through my home screen, but very few of us have probably seen conflict resolution done well. And it's not been modeled well. And that leads to division after division, in my opinion. I think there's some answers available for that, but we're in a pretty big mess, if you will, to say that there's 41,000 Christian denominations, and to say that we can just smooth that all over and become one church again and all of that. It will be that way in the new heaven and the new earth. So I think we need to be, that is the goal, and it will be that way. But I think in order to successfully get there, we need to be orienting that way now. And we may not be able to solve the global crisis, if you will, of division, but rather begin in our own, circles of influence, like where you are, Wendell, for example, or where any one of us are. Just begin to think that way and work that way, and look for ways to resolve conflict, and hopefully we can see the tide turn. In fact, I think it kind of is, because I actually hear this a lot. Again, maybe just reading through my own home screen, but it's something that I'm interested in, and I hear a lot of it as well. And I think there is a real sense that there is something broken. I think most people would agree, or I'll say it this way. People have observed that at the time of the Reformation, something seems to have got broken. And the divisions happened at an accelerated rate after the Reformation. And if you take even my own background, which goes back through the conservative conferences, like the conservative Mennonite conferences, back through to the old to Weaverland Conference, and then that goes back to Old Order Conference. To Weaverland, back to Lancaster Conference, and all of that. If you take the time period from like the 60s, 50s, 60s, when those divisions began to happen, they happen on the average about every 10 years. And that's just deplorable, in my opinion. And if you look at the span, I think maybe the first one was necessary, I don't know. But if you look at the span from where those divisions over the last 70 years have gotten the churches, look at the most conservative, if you will, to the most liberal. From an outsider's perspective, the differences are very small indeed. Even though we tend to make a big deal about the differences are actually very small. And I think were probably, in many cases, resolvable. And I have a whole theory about what actually got broken and why, but that would take a whole other presentation, and I'm not going there today.